By the way, for those of you catching the restream, I started the stream a bit earlier than the start time of 8 p.m. So you might, in order to stop wasting your own time, it might be beneficial for you to skip forward at least 5 minutes to get to the good stuff. After this video is finished streaming, at some point I'll add timestamp, so you'll be able to just click the timestamp and go right to the meat of the presentation. So, for those of you watching in the future, thanks for joining. Well, hello, Kevin. Thank you for joining.
Hello, hello. Happy to be here.
So I'm just going to give our other attendees a few more minutes to stop on by, and then I'll get this party started.
All right.
So, out of curiosity, while we're waiting, have you yourself had much experience with performing pieces that were informed by the sonification of data?
No, I think I'm brand new to the subject.
Wonderful. So yeah, and for those of you watching on YouTube, this is actually going to be the first in a series of webinars dealing with music and technology. We'll be updating the community on when further episodes will air. That's still to be determined, but we will keep you updated both on this channel and on our website at contemporaryartmusicproject.org. Furthermore, if you enjoy and find value in the content that we provide, please consider supporting us by donating. There's a donation button right on our website. And we really can't keep all of these projects going without your support. So thank you. A hearty thank you to all of you who have supported us. And we look forward to welcoming even more of you into the fold, and put your name on our donors page. So let me check the health of the stream quick a minute. Oh, looks like it's still going. Oh, ooh. Well, hello, Anya, and hello, Dorothy.
Hey
Yep.
Benjamin, how are you?
Glad you can make it. I'm
Yeah,
doing
glad to be here.
peachy.
I don't know if this was a closed shop. I shared this link with some other people. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay, all right. Yeah,
Yeah.
my son. So
Oh, that your son is more than welcome to stop
good.
on by.
Yeah, he's doing programs using of pieces written for MIDI keyboards,
Oh, okay.
as well as he's a pianist. Hey,
Fantastic.
Yumi.
Well,
Yumi, do you know Jacob? You know him,
Oh,
right?
yes, yes.
Good.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Sorry,
hey,
Benji.
buddy. Long time no see.
Hello, good to
Yeah.
see you.
Yeah,
See all
likewise.
of you.
So, yeah, I'm very happy to see all of you here, and here's hoping Jacob can stop on by. I'll give our anyone else who's hoping to stop by a couple more minutes before I begin the festivities. But for those of you both in the Zoom room with me and who may be watching on YouTube, either now or in the future, this is a first, in fact, this is a pilot episode in this webinar series that I'm hoping to continue dealing with music and technology. So today's topic has to do with mapping and sonification. And I want to do further episodes on, for instance, the use of motion sensors with mapping gesture to sound generation and even like formal structure of pieces. Telematic music techniques, just kind of, sharing insights that I have and hoping to glean insights from the rest of you on this topic. So this is very much a two-way street. So, and hello, Patrick. Welcome.
Good to see
So,
you. Good to see everyone. Hi.
likewise. So, I think I might as well get this started, and I'll admit more guests as they arrive. So, I don't want to take too much of your time, as it is for some of us. It's getting it's approaching our bedtimes. So, yeah, let me share screen. Oops. Okay, so today I'd like to talk about mapping and sonification. So, on the agenda for tonight's program, I'm first going to lead the discussion on what mapping is, and I'm going to um, play an example of a piece of mine where I employ mapping. And this will be the part of the webinar that actually does not really make use of technology, but will kind of ease us into the subject. Then I'm going to start our discussion on data sonification, what that is at the very least. I'd like to talk about why data sonification is important, the advancements that have been seen in the field, especially with respect to the availability of for the average consumer in respect to more powerful computing hardware, programming languages tailored to the processing of this data and mapping onto different musical parameters, evolutions in thought of effective mapping strategies. And I also want to bring to the table some challenges facing the practice. And in these 2 points, I'll briefly cite some papers that I've read on these topics. As data sonification has a lot of potential, but there is definitely room to grow. And in particular, there does exist a rift between the science community at large and composers and other sound artists employing sonification, and to find ways to bring both communities together and further refine the art of data sonification, as it's not only a great tool for generating musical material, generating visual material, and basically becoming fodder for artistic expression, but it's also useful as truly a tool for scientific analysis. And yeah, that will be also part of the section I have on moving forward. And after my presentation, I would like to open the floor to all of you, where I hope we can get into a discussion, because I know there are several of you in the audience who are composers, artists, performers that may have experience writing music, utilizing external data that you've mapped onto various parameters for artistic purposes or possibly even analytical purposes. And some of you have performed these pieces, or and maybe you have experiences to share with regard to collaborating with scientists. So all of this and more I would like to touch upon tonight. So before I continue with my presentation, because I don't want this to be really just a webinar just for the initiated, I also intend this to be an introduction to the topic for those either in the Zoom room or who may be watching, who don't know what I'm talking about at all. But it sounds cool and they want to learn. So I have some excerpts that I have curated from YouTube that I would like to share now. Actually, 2 excerpts and then 1 full piece, which is like 2 minutes. So let me now, and here's hoping I'll make sure share sound. What is this optimize for video clip? Okay, sounds good to me. I hope I didn't screw something up. So let me now move over to Chrome. And here is hoping that the sound will work. So the first video I want to show is a video that I'm sure if you've not seen this video, you have undoubtedly seen a video like it. So it's What Does Pi Sound Like, which is A favorite subject, especially every March 14th, which is Pi Day. It seems like there's a new video added online about what pi sounds like. And so I would like to play excerpts from two approaches to sonifying pi. So here's the first approach. Now I have fast forwarded it to the 55-second mark. I'm just going to play maybe 15, 20 seconds because it gives enough of an idea. As in all of Number Files videos, they're all super engrossing and fascinating, but there's talking through all of it. So it took a while to find just like the excerpt where there is no talking, because for the rest of the video, even as he's playing music, he's talking over it. So we'll be able to hear what pi sounds like mapped to the C major scale. So here we go. And those of you in Zoom with me, please let me know in the chat if for whatever reason the sound isn't working. I hope it is.
Musical it can sound. Pi is a transcendental number. It's this jumble of digits. You'd expect it would sound very, very...
Okay, so that is pi mapped to the C major scale, and looking at Patrick's facial expressions, I'm presuming the sound did come through. Fantastic. Now let's go ahead and hear pi mapped to the C major pentatonic scale. Now this mapping strategy actually exists in a number of layers. And for those of you who are familiar with Messiaen, this composer opts for a similar approach to his, and I'm sorry, I don't speak French, so if I butcher this pronunciation, the mot du valeur et d'intensité, as the intensity itself is not mapped, but both pitch and rhythmic duration is. The composer also mentions intonation, though I didn't exactly grasp what they meant by that. But I'll play the introduction and then part of the pi sonification. It'll last for a little over a minute. All right, so it's a bit happy-go-lucky, and with any pentatonic scale, it's never gonna sound bad. So these are two pretty surface level, though. I find the accompaniment a little, a little much in this. Nevertheless, I thought the mapping strategy was a bit more advanced than the usual approaches in mapping the number to music. Now, I want to end this introductory exploration I'll play the entire piece. It's only 1:40, Far and Wide, and it's part of the Microbial Bebop project that was led by Peter Larson at the Argonne National Laboratory. And In this piece, microbial species of the order Rickettsialis, such as the highly abundant free-living planktonic species Pelagibacter ublique, are typical highly abundant taxa in L4 station data. Its relative abundance in the microbial community at L4 station follows a distinctive seasonal pattern. In this composition, there are 2 chords per measure generated from photosynthetically active radiation measurements and temperature. The melody of each measure is 6 notes that describe the relative abundance of the order Rickettsialis. The first note of each measure is from the relative abundance at a time point. The next 5 notes of a measure follow one of the following patterns: a continuous rise in pitch, a continuous drop in pitch, a rise then drop in pitch, or a drop then rise in pitch. These patterns are matched to the relative abundance of Rickettsialis at the given time point relative to the previous and subsequent time points. The pattern of notes in a measure is mapped to the relative abundance of Rickettsialis with fewer rests per measure, indicating higher abundance. For time points at which Rickettsialis was the most abundant microbial taxa, the corresponding measure is highlighted with a symbol crash. So there's a lot going on here, but needless to say, not only is pitch informed by the data, but also texture and even non-pitched events to highlight certain significant moments in the data. So I'll go ahead and play the entire piece far and wide. Okay, so now that we have in our ears some examples of data sonification, granted tailored for, a kind of a standard YouTube audience, I want to now dive into my presentation. And by the way, if you have questions or comments as I'm presenting, please don't hesitate to raise your virtual hand. So let's go back to PowerPoint. So before I talk about how data is mapped, I think it's good to talk about what mapping is. So in the broadest sense, mapping is an operation that associates elements of one set to elements of another set. It is a generic term and applies to a wide variety of musical activity, including everything from performance practice, notation, analytical tools, composition, and more. For any of you watching who are musicians, you already engage in mapping and are experienced with it. After all, what is musical notation but the mapping of certain rules, arbitrary rules regarding note head, stemming, the lines on a staff, the spaces between the lines, mapping all of that to rhythm and pitch that we then execute on our instruments. Mapping is typically achieved in some sort of consistent fashion, though the relationship between elements of the two sets need not be linear. Logarithmic, exponential, and even completely arbitrary mapping solutions can be used. And I want to just talk about one of my own pieces. Actually, I'll be presenting two of my own pieces in this presentation, in addition to others. So the first piece I want to share, at least an excerpt from, is my piece for chamber orchestra, Tempus Imperfectum. I was commissioned by the Illinois Modern Ensemble in 2014 to compose Tempus Imperfectum. At the time, I was fascinated by Machot's rondo Ma fin est mon commencement and was looking to write a piece of music inspired by it and derived from it without it featuring any quotations or variations on it. I went about this task by mapping the linear intervallic content of each voice to rhythmic durations. It was a crude one-to-one mapping where each semitone from one note to the next note in a part was represented by a 16th note subdivision of the beat. While the rhythmic content was solely determined by the mapping operation, the pitch material was generated fairly freely, though nevertheless subject to strict retrograde post-climax. However, unlike in Machot's masterwork, I subjected the pitch material to a tritone transposition in order to execute an imperfect retrograde process. So, what I'm going to do next is play part of Machot's piece so you can get in your ears the material that I mapped to rhythm. And then I'm going to play an excerpt from Tempus Imperfectum. I'm not going to play the intro, nor am I going to play the coda, as neither of those parts of my piece actually feature the mapping. But I'm going to play the parts that do. However, there is going to be a moment where, in fact, it's quite literally when the retrograde happens, it's the climax of the piece. And for a period of time, it's just essentially chaotic, just gesturing by the instruments. But once that chaos dies away, then the retrograde at the tritone comes to pass. So let me go back once again. I wish there was like a way to quickly jump between windows. If there is, I'm just not smart enough to know. I'm going to jump back to YouTube, where I'm going to share part of the piece that inspired me for this piece. I'm sure everybody in this Zoom call has heard it, but for those of you on YouTube who may not have heard it, Okay. Now I'm going to share the results of my mapping process from my piece, and I'll share the score as well for those of you interested in taking a look at that. So let's screen. May have to do desktop. Okay, so, oh, thank you, Dorothy. So that was the result of my rhythmic mapping from, oh, thank you, everybody, from Michaud's piece, from his rondo to my chamber orchestra piece. So the pitch material itself was not based off of any of his language, it was purely my own, but his piece nevertheless informed the rhythmic material in my piece. So there was a connection there. Not only that, but I also wanted to take his rather innovative approach to form and put my own spin on it. So it was a useful generative tool for composition. So now that I think, oh yes, Anya,
I have a quick question.
yeah.
I'm curious, how did you map out the rhythm? Was it to all the instruments at
Mhm.
once, or like linearly? Like, I'm just curious.
Oh, no, that's a very good question. So when I was sketching the piece, I essentially used three staves, and the three in a short score form, and each staff contained the rhythmic mapping of one of the three parts of the rondo. And what I would do is I would just assign different instruments to assume like their attacks would assume where my mapping would dictate an attack should be. Now, the duration of the pitches itself was freely determined by me as far as how long they were sustained, but the attack points were rigid. So every time my mapping dictated, okay, like there is a major second between these like what one voice is singing, like that note and the next note. Then after an eighth beat, so 2/16 beats, another attack would occur in the instruments assigned to that voice. Does that make sense? Yeah. I also use my own discretion orchestrationally speaking. Sometimes like I wouldn't have like each of the instruments assigned to a voice play all the time. I would make stylistic decisions based on what I wanted to achieve texturally and sonically, but nevertheless, each voice had a subset of instruments that would be responsible for playing at least at some points whenever the mapping dictated there needed to be a note played there. Thank you. Okay, moving forward. Sonification. Sonification is the act of mapping an element of a set not typically associated with sound or music onto some musical property. This has traditionally been accomplished using pitch or rhythm in the music set. So recall that in YouTuber Your MJK's sonification of pi, they used a hybridized approach. And in fact, one of the very first sonification solutions, the Geiger counter, uses exclusively rhythm as its solution. Where, if you're not familiar with a Geiger counter, it's how traditionally radiation is measured in any space, and the more radiation or radioactive elements are detected, the faster the clicking sounds are emanated. There have also been examples of pieces composed using multiple degrees of mapping. So a good example is one of the earliest sonified pieces, which is John Cage's Atlas Eclipticalis. In this piece, the composer superimposed musical staves over the eponymous star chart published by Antonin Becvar, which then determined the pitch, durational, and dynamic material for the piece. I'll play a little excerpt from it, but why I say that this involves multiple degrees of mapping is that Cage mapped the stars in the star chart directly onto musical staves, which themselves, as I'd mentioned earlier, are examples of mapping onto pitch. So it's essentially a degree removed from directly mapping the star's locations on the star chart to pitch. So, going once again back to YouTube. Uh-oh, did I lose it? Oh no, it's just on a different screen now, that's why. I think I'll have to bring this back up again. There it is. And this is a performance of the piece by Wesleyan University's orchestra. I'll just start from the beginning and play a minute or two. Okay, I'm going to try to scan. I think there's a good example what the superimposed star chart looks like a little bit later in the video. Maybe I missed it. I thought there was a moment where maybe I was thinking of a different source, but essentially, how Cage achieved the mapping was not only did he overlay the staves onto the star chart, but the size of the star on the staff would determine the intensity of the material. So, which is, you know, instead of using dynamic notation, that is what would determine how loud or how softly a performer would play their material. So, yeah, so that is an example of an early example of sonification, and sonification of astronomical, so scientific data. All right. So next I want to play, again, a bit of one more piece of mine, and this is my piece Illumina, Arabidopsis thaliana. 2015 brought with it a collaborative event between the UIUC Composition and Genomic Biology divisions known as the Sound of Science, where composers were tasked to find some creative way to represent their paired genomic biologists' research in a piece of music. Out of this project came my piece Illumina, Arabidopsis thaliana, informed by the research and genomic biologist Alil K. Grennan's work on the Arabidopsis thaliana leaf. Grennan's research involved engineering Arabidopsis leaves containing chloroplasts of differing sizes and quantities, measuring the effects of each on photosynthetic efficacy. The datasets Grennan provided included photosynthetic rates, namely the percentages of light reflection, absorption, and transmission, and the movement of the chloroplasts through the leaves over time. While data sonification was an obvious and expected approach to such a project, I wanted my piece to be more than rudimentary data sonification. My goal was to find artfully sensitive ways to represent her research without distorting it. So I went about doing this by not only just mapping her data to pitch material. In fact, much of my piece is not really pitched in a traditional sense, but her data found its way into my additive synthesis approach. So, for instance, certain sonic entities in this electroacoustic piece, for lack of a better term, would have like the number of harmonics that comprised the entity, not how, like, the different frequencies of each overtone, the intensity, the shaping, the enveloping applied to each overtone. That was all informed by her data. The formal structure of the piece also took shape from her data. There are some found sounds nevertheless added for color, and also to punctuate certain salient moments in the data, much like we saw with the microbial bebop piece earlier on. But most of the material that you're going to hear is indeed sonification of the data, but in a way that I felt was also musically interesting. So without further ado, I will share that. In the interest of time, I want to fast forward to a portion of my piece where using spatialization, and I'm hoping the spatialization's coming across over Zoom because I know Zoom likes to screw that up. Because this piece was originally intended for reproduction over an 8-channel surround sound system. So the stereo mixdown was actually put together using ambisonics. So I tried to also mimic the feeling of depth that one would get listening to this over a surround sound system. But the selection I want to play next has to do with the movement of chloroplasts through the leaf. And I had taken the positional data of each of the chloroplasts over time and spatialized that. So let me fast forward that now. Okay. So that was an excerpt from Illumina Arabidopsis thaliana, and it was my first ever attempt at data sonification and collaborating with a scientist. And I felt it was actually a very rewarding experience, and it's a piece that I feel still holds up today. Though, if I were to go about this, my approach to sonification now, I would have done it quite a bit differently. And this leads me into the next part of my presentation. And are there any questions or anything so far, or are we ready to move on? Okay, let's move on. So, oh, I almost hit the wrong button there. I almost ended the meeting. So why sonification is important? In their paper, Creative Aspects of Sonification, Karma researchers Oded Ben-Tal and Jonathan Berger observed the following. The act of listening to music involves tracking simultaneous changes in variables, integrating them into a comprehensive mental image. The application of musical listening habits to multiple superimposed dimensions of sonified data points could potentially result in the unveiling of patterns distinguishing relationships that may be otherwise difficult to perceive. As computing power, digital audio tools, and the field of data sonification continue to evolve, more creative ways to map data onto musical parameters emerge. Unfortunately, while there is no recording that's extant of this piece, Ben-Tal made extensive use of formant filters to sonify oceanographic measurements taken over time from the Mediterranean Sea. And he made some really good arguments as to why that's a very effective mapping solution, because as human beings, we are hardwired not only to acquire language, but part of that process is the parsing of audible data into sounds that we can potentially interpret as language. And as such, the ability to distinguish between vowel sounds, is something that we tend to do very well. And so mapping certain you know, data sets onto different vowel sounds, like maybe changing the vowel sound as the intensity or the density or whatever the data is measuring increases or decreases, can be a very effective way in having the audience really connect the sounds that they're hearing to the evolution of data over time. Spatialization is growing increasingly as a sonification tool, such as in Illumina Arabidopsis Thaliana, the second excerpt I played from that piece, which can be realized even over a stereo playback system thanks to the advent of ambisonics. Since we perceive sound and music linearly, data sonification shines when conveying information that evolves over time, especially when that information deals with density or intensity. So we naturally perceive amplitude as intensity of music, and that can be mapped onto different intensities, like if maybe the temperature of the earth could be something that could be mapped onto intensity of sound. Density of texture or the sparsity of texture is something we're also particularly sensitive to, and it is an aspect of music that we are already used to tracking subconsciously over time. And actually, before I move on to the next point, I want to impress that Benthal and Berger in their paper made a good case for the fact that as human beings, we naturally apply musical listening to any auditory or audible event that we essentially go into expecting music to be there. So really tying the musical experience into the sonification strategy can make for effective ways of rendering data and providing a picture of the information conveyed by the data to not only be of use for scientists' analysis, but also to inform the public. Sonification has shown to be an effective outreach tool, fostering interest among young people in the sciences. Simply look at the comments section and number of views of any algorithmically supported YouTube video that renders some math or science data into sound, like the Pi videos that we started with. One can clearly see the emotional connection some have made after listening to the music. So these are positive aspects of sonification and ways that music, not just, because it's trivially easy to come up with essentially a Geiger counter solution. Temperature goes up, loudness goes up. Temperature goes down, loudness goes down. It's essentially the Mickey Mousing approach, but to science. But by approaching the craft musically, it's possible to show the evolution of multiple data sets over time in a way that does not become overbearing to audiences, and especially with data sets that even visually can be difficult to parse at a glance. But this isn't to say that there aren't challenges facing the practice. In her paper, Sound Information, Sonification in the Age of Complex Data and Digital Audio, Maastricht University professor Alexandra Zupper critically examined the practice of sonification and identified areas in which the practice is struggling. For one, composers and sound artists tend to fixate on devising new ways to render data without regard for how it would be interpreted by specialists in the fields from which the data is drawn. The controversial role of listening in the scientific method, noting that even acousticians prefer creating visual representations of the sounds that they study. The conflation of data and information prevalent in the sonification community hinders the pursuit of effective mapping strategies, as many assume the information is already clear in the data without further interpretation or contextualization. And in fact, in her paper, she really drives this point home that it is tempting. And I have to admit, I was even guilty of that in my piece, which is why I had mentioned I would go about it differently now. It's tempting to assume that the data and the information is the same. And that is an attitude that is predominant in sonification. That by audiating the data in some either obvious or musically informed approach, the information will pop out of the texture. And that's not always the case. So as such, many scientists unfairly treat sonification as a gimmick used to promote science among the masses, but not as a useful analytical tool. Oh, I see there's a message in the chat. Oh, can you tell me more about we perceive sound and music linearly? Yeah, so as opposed to some visual representation, where it will take time to really absorb all of the information. Even just reading a number on the screen technically takes time to interpret, even though it's negligible. When it comes to sound, it is impossible to present the entire picture. So to even have access to the full audio image of this piece of music or this excerpt of, or this piece of sound art at any given point in time, because it takes time to just present the full picture. And not only that, but we are dependent on our sense of memory to store the sound image that we've already heard. Because unlike with visuals where, we're looking at, let's say we're looking at a painting, we can go back and forth to study different areas of the painting as much as we want. But, in a performance, we can't just jump back and forth to re-listen to music we just heard. It's already been played. Now, if we're listening to it on an audio player at our own leisure, it's a little bit different. But even still, it takes time. We can't just do a quick cursory glance and get a superficial understanding of the entire work. We still need to listen to it all. I suppose we could listen to it on like 1.5 times, 2 times speed even. But the point is that music and just audio itself is something that we do perceive laterally, or we perceive over time. But that brings with it some advantages, because then we're extra, I'd go over this on the next slide, but we're extra sensitive to how the sound changes over time. I hope that answered your question. So moving forward, how do we address these challenges? Well, Zupper nevertheless feels as if there is a great deal of potential to be found in sonification, especially in the digital age where the very nature of audio is data to be converted directly into sound. Sonification can be of immense value when parsing large or complex data sets, too overwhelming to process visually without a significant amount of time devoted to its study. She proposes that both composers and sound artists practicing data sonification need to pursue meaningful collaboration where musical mapping techniques devised by the composer are then heard and critically examined by the scientist, providing feedback to help the composer refine their mapping solution further so that the result is both musical and useful for gleaning information from the sonified data. All right. So with that being said on my end, I would like to open the floor to all of you. So, sonification, yay or nay? Actually, yeah, I like the thumbs up approach, but I'm curious, actually, for those of you attending this Zoom meeting, especially, I like to start with the composers. Have you had experience yourself in using sonification of data in any of your pieces? Be it scientific data or maybe even data or it could be data in the most generic sense, just values that were coming from something not originally musical, but that you used as in your pre-compositional approach to a piece. Anya.
Hi. This was really cool, by the way. I enjoyed
Oh,
this
thank you.
session. Yeah, so to answer your question, I don't know if it fully counts, but I wrote a poem that plays with like some like syllables, and then I kind of used that to map out some musical sections.
I remember this piece actually. Yeah, I
Yeah,
believe you presented it at USF.
yeah. I think so. So yeah, I don't know if it fully counts because I was also the one creating the poem, right? I did like take something that was not mine or like some data.
Oh, you don't. In this case, I'm not. You don't have to be. You don't have to sonify someone else's data. I mean, it could actually. You could absolutely be even a scientist who wants to sonify their own data in music. So, the fact that you were the source of both the extra musical and the musical result doesn't make it any less of a mapping experiment.
Yeah,
That was a cool piece, by the way.
thank you. Yeah, I think like I'm curious about your philosophical approach to using sonification.
Mhm.
I think for me, when I was mapping these sounds from my poem, it was still comforting because I was also in control of the poem. Like I could change it if I wanted to. And it also had a lot of like musical sonic properties within like just like the sounds of the words themselves. But one thing that I'm always worried about, taking data from a source is that what if I don't like what I come up with musically? I mean, then I would have to kind of change the rules and things like that. But um, I mean, it can definitely help generate material, but it can also be very constraining in some ways. So I'm curious, like, what is your approach to creating rules that that also musically would work well?
That's a very good question. Um, and whenever students of mine ask me similar questions, not necessarily about sonification, but about like what if you don't like what comes out of your pre-compositional engine? And I like the I like Herbert Brune's philosophy regarding this, where I don't know if you're familiar with the rather controversial character who has long since passed away, but he was a composer, a very influential composer who taught at the University of Illinois for many years. In fact, his old residence is now a performance, a place where new music is performed. Um, and that his approach is always pre-composition first, and that essentially determines the output. And in order to kind of discipline himself to continue this experimentation, he had a saying where he writes music that he will come to like. So I'm not saying that that has to be the approach you take, and that's not necessarily the approach I always take. However, it kind of, I feel like when I'm engaging in mapping, whether it be the Michaud or alleles data, I kept in mind, well, let me focus more on my collaboration with Allele. I wanted some way to really like take her data, which didn't presuppose any relation with music. And I knew from the start that I didn't want it just to do like, oh, the chloroplast moved this fast at this point in time, so that's an E flat. I didn't want to go that approach. Or even like amplitude or just simple texture mapping. But I really, I took about, because I had plenty of time to work on this piece, I took about half a month just experimenting with lots of different approaches. Like I would run her data through different tools to see what it would generate. And I would keep the bits that I thought were musically meaningful and found, I mean, some still ended up on the cutting room floor, but a lot of it ended up in the piece. And I would then find a way to take something about her data, and I don't have the specifics on hand. It was so long ago. I don't remember precisely what drove the form, but I nevertheless mapped a part of her data onto even the formal structure that would then encompass the aspects that I had run through these tools of her data that I felt were musically compatible with the form. So it was almost like I just generated too much content and found just aspects of it, components of it that work together musically. But that was my philosophy then. Now I'm much more mindful of the communicative potential. At the time, I was really more interested in a really satisfying musical result, and I still am. But now, especially after the research I've done in because sonification is still a very avid interest I have, and I'm starting to really be mindful of cognition and how human beings parse data, whether that data be visual or auditory, and to find ways that not only are musically viable, but also makes clear the information that I want to convey, the information that is found in the data. And that's something that I didn't want to bog down my presentation with, but really the difference between data and information is the data is the numerical data, whatever data points you get. The information is what does it mean and the impact of it. And I think being mindful of that, which I think the part of my piece I'm most proud of Illumina is the spatialization minute. It actually took me an entire month to complete because I was using this additive synthesis tool that couldn't in its GUI accommodate, or the graphic interface accommodate, all of the data points. So I'd actually use Vim and type all of the data points in by hand, and it took a month to do. I spent a good deal of the Seamus conference actually I was at just typing all that in, but that was the part of the piece I feel that still to this day does deliver that connection, that real meaningful connection between the information found in the data and the music. The rest of the piece, I think it's a good piece, but I feel like listening back to it that I could have been more successful.
Well, if I interrupt really quickly.
Oh, yes.
Of course, I have not composed anything with the mapping but we program Illumina for our collaborative concert in June with the Atlas Modern Ballet Company, and I thought it was interesting because it was choreographed, and we picked a piece. We thought it was beautiful, and it was danceable.
Yeah, the excerpt that I saw just blew me away. Like it made me fall in love with the piece again.
I mean, I feel like there's kind of interesting, another layer of mapping that if we talk with choreographer.
Yeah, no, I wish I could have been there because I really wanted to talk to the choreographer and the video artist because I thought their material really meshed well with my music, and I was curious to hear their own strategies and mapping, yeah, their respective crafts onto my piece. So
Yeah. So just wanted to.
thank you, and Anya, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a very fascinating topic. I'm gonna keep thinking about it.
Great. And Dorothy, I saw you raised your hand.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. I want to throw out two names of composers who have written great pieces that have sonified data. One is Uri Kojs, Kojs, and he
Oh,
has a
yes.
whole series where he's an orchid expert, and he has sonified the DNA of numerous species of orchid, and he sets up these wonderful installations, and some of them are even interactive where you can enter the orchid in and it will generate the music. And another is Anro Cheng, and her dissertation was called Hello Universe, and each movement takes a different approach to sonifying information from NASA and the sounds that NASA has on its website. She analyzed them spectrally, and it's just really interesting. But and I've sonified many, many things and mapped many, many things, and I just have a different way of thinking about it. I have a reaction to Zuper's notes, and you're very, very respectful of this idea that the music convey the information. And I'm not. Like, the way I see it is we have different purposes. You know, as a composer, I'm writing music. As a scientist, they're publishing data and information. And for me, I see it more as a metaphorical or a technique within the working of a composition, and it serves me poetically, but musically I'm not really interested in sharing that kind of information. Also, I find it interesting that you talk about Herbert Brunn and the pre-composition, because I don't consider pre-composition a thing. I think as soon as you're thinking about a piece of music, you're composing. And so that, I think it is all one and the same thing, like your respect for the information and the artist and the fact that I don't care, so I'm getting to a question. When I map something, it's to get material for a piece. And then I do what I want to with the material that serves the piece. Do you just sort of take the results of your mapping, or do you adjust them? Would you consider adjusting them?
Well, that's a very good question. There have been plenty of times where I have generated music algorithmically, and I have no problem whatsoever. No matter how rigorously I would have liked to stay adhering to the results, to essentially infuse glitches into the matrix, so to speak. And I do that frequently because I feel like when I'm composing, I don't want to compromise my own artistic sensitivities. It's my piece. I can do what I want. And I think your point is well taken, and I absolutely respect the fact that utilizing instead you're essentially being inspired. You're forging a connection with the data that you're sonifying in a piece of strong music, and I think that's an absolutely valid approach, and not one that I have any problems with. I nevertheless, now again, in my piece Illumina, I still had very much a similar opinion as you did, because or that you do, that I want the piece to be good. I don't want to have a piece that's essentially just an analytical tool. Nevertheless, I forced myself to remain steadfast in applying results from strict adherence to the data. But I had so much material generated, and I might have maybe, like, for instance, changed some, like, I'd still keep the relationships intact, like the linear relationships intact, but maybe expanded the duration of certain values, or maybe I could have slightly tweaked the scale of the mapping in certain respects. So the relationship's still there, but the result itself is massaged in a way that I feel helps to build and helps to work with the piece. I didn't feel uncomfortable doing so, because at the end of the day, it's still informed by the data, even if I changed one of my own variables I applied to the transformation. But I just, after really thinking about it more over the past several years, I just feel like, it depends, I think, on the purpose behind the piece. If I want the piece to really, if it's a collaborative effort with a scientist, I don't want, and I don't want to distort the information that they're trying to convey. And I wouldn't, just like I wouldn't want them to dictate the style of music I'm composing. So, I want it to be meaningful for both creative parties involved and for the audience to glean something from it. But at the same time, if I feel inspired to use data as, and by the way, I also agree, pre-composition is composition. I was essentially using terminology of that university, but using data as really an engine for compositional generation. I want to write a piece that's inspired by the work of scientists in whatever field I admire, but I'm not intending it on being a representation of the information they're conveying. Then I feel like absolutely there's a lot of these issues that Zuper brings up in her article are no longer issues, because it's kind of besides the point.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that in her article, it's very clear that it's the idea of sonification as serving a scientist in representing their data, not as creating a work of music. So do you find, so I love that you're talking about your collaboration with scientists and sort of the give and take that would be necessary there, and how you don't want them infringing on your creative control and your style at the same time. And I guess, just to refine the point, I think there can be sonifications. They're not necessarily compositions, right?
Agreed.
And so yeah, as a composer, I kind of feel like ultimately I've got to make a good piece of music, irrespective of what the scientist wants me to do. Of course, that's true of everybody, right? Irrespective of the performer or the. Don't get me in trouble. I'm in trouble now. YouTube, don't pay attention to what I just said.
I will. I'll say this to kind of to further your point. I think one of the magical things of being composer, of composition, is that really, no matter what constraints we place upon ourselves, we have effectively if maybe not always infinite, some of the constraints can be so limiting that there is a finite number of options at our disposal. But even with strict and stringent constraints that we place on ourselves, we can find endlessly creative ways of applying it. And your point is well taken. You know, at the end of the day, we want to express ourselves in the best way possible. And I think it's one of those really compelling aspects of being a composer, you know, to overcome these challenges. So.
I'd be super interested in Patrick's thoughts.
Yeah, me too. I've been waiting for Patrick to raise his hand.
Oh my God, you calling on me?
Yes, the teacher's calling on you.
I have a little bit of sonification experience, not with a scientist, but in 2011, I wrote a piece for violin and electronics, and all the pitch materials was based on this ancient Chinese board game called Weiqi, or maybe more well known as Go from the Japanese turn. So I basically looked at an ancient game from 15th century or something, and basically mapped all the coordinates of the stones that are placed on the Go board, and then mapped them as pitch. I mean, I could have done it for the rhythm or anything else, but I think in my mind that sonification really is the interpretation of the composer, and I could have mapped it, you know, in 100 different ways, and ended up sounding like Patrick's music in my mind. And that really was my only experience with sonifying a set of data, but not with a scientist.
I see. Would it be something that you might be interested in pursuing in the future, or not particularly?
Possibly. Maybe collaborating with someone who can provide me with a set of data, then I can, in some way, with my composing mind, to sonify them in a musically convincing way.
Yeah, you should, you know, reach out to the STEM community in your institution. You'd be surprised. So, like, when I worked with, when the group of composers, because I was one of the founding members of the initiative at the University of Illinois, but we got a number of composers and genomic biologists together, and there was almost more excitement in the genomic biology department than there was in the music department. It was really amazing to see. And so many of the scientists had musical backgrounds or real interests in music, or they had, you know, they're like the biologist I worked with. Her parents were musicians. Her older sister is like a glass blower, and she's like the odd person out as a genomic biologist. So, you know, if anything too, it actually helps bring STEM and the arts together. And I mean, I don't know about you, but these days, especially with the news out of Brandeis, feeling a little vulnerable.
And you know, the scientists get big grants. They have a lot of money.
Do.
Right, yeah. So after hours and hours of working in the labs, these scientists really want to hear the result.
Well, and you know, and something that also became apparent was that for scientists, you know, whether, you know, I found they were not interested in direct sonification. That was like, for instance, Alil really liked the fact that I made a piece inspired by her data. And she felt a personal connection, as she rightfully should, between my piece and her work. So, you know, it's an effective form at the very least of outreach. So, and Body, I'd like to hear, you know, your experience, if any, given, and you know what, also mapping data visually, given you're a well accomplished visual artist.
Actually, I've never done data visualization in the
Hmm.
style that you did, that like get the inspiration from data. I always, anything that I have done so far is live interpretation of data, either from like emotion capturing devices or like for my research. I'm working closely with neuroengineering labs that we translate, sonify, and visualize the interbrain synchronicity of the dancers or performers to and I do the like artistic visualization
Yeah.
and sonification, which is it's an abstract form of visualization. My hope was making something that makes sense for the scientists that are looking or listening, but also it is a full piece of art. Also, not only that is a performative, it has a performance element and it has a story to tell also. But I'm now very actually inspired by like, oh, I can employ that in my actually acoustic works also, to just use the data sonification and manipulation. But it's a very fun thing to do. Like for installations, I make, especially right now with like all of the technologies out there. Like recently, I got to learn a little bit about the media pipeline from Google, which is like a fantastic machine learning tool for free that like you can use your camera as like a really accurate motion sensoring device, and then you can do bunch with it, which is like fantastic. So yeah, but like I never wrote a piece that is inspired by the data.
Well, I encourage
It's a
you.
new
In fact,
thing.
I encourage all composers who are in the Zoom room and who may be watching on YouTube now or in the future to give it a try if you haven't already. Reach out. If you're in a university studying for your undergraduate degree in composition, or if you're a master's, a doctoral student, it's absolutely the perfect time to involve yourself in trying to bring together musicians and those in STEM that might otherwise feel alienated from the arts, but they're not. But that's not by their own choice or desire. And you also end up getting performers involved. I wrote a piece of fixed media acousmatic music, but other composers wrote pieces that were performed by chamber ensembles. So it gets performers excited, and we got a good turnout at both during both years I was involved with the project. So and it was something that, because at the University of Illinois, the music, even though it's a fantastic music school, music performances tend to be really under attended. Whereas the Sound of Science, it was really well attended by lots of people, even from the community, because it was advertised. So, I just think it's in this day and age, it's important that we foster a feeling of community and of togetherness, because the more we isolate ourselves in our respective ivory towers, the easier it is for our towers to topple. So, yeah. Yes, Dorothy.
Can I just say thank you, Benjamin and Yunmi and all the camp people for making this happen and building this community?
Well, I really appreciate your gratitude, and on behalf of the organization, I would like to thank you, Dorothy, and Bodie, and Patrick, and all of you watching, for really supporting us and helping our cause, because we couldn't do it without you. It's we feel very enamored with our community, and the fact that you're passionate about what we do makes us even more passionate. So, thank you so much. Well, everyone, I think I'll call it here. I really appreciate everyone in this Zoom room, the time you took to be with us today. It means a lot to me. And for all of you on YouTube watching, really, we appreciate your support. And for those of you who may not know what it is we do, go to our site at contemporaryartmusicproject.org. You can find out more. We have a call for scores or for works that is ongoing for Campground 24. This will be our third international festival of new music. Yeah, please apply today. If you're a young composer in the state of Florida, we also have a call out so that you can potentially work with a very talented youth poetry group in Tampa. Work with them on a new piece. You get performed. You'll have a performance and another performance at Campground. So we have a lot of exciting things to offer. And if you found any value from this presentation or anything that we do, we just ask that you consider supporting us. We have a donation button on our website. Whatever you can donate, we would absolutely be thrilled with. You'll get your name on the donors page. And you'll really be able to feel part of this community because you are a part of this community. So thank you so much again, everyone, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your night. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.